in the Middle East and Syria specifically. You can't, in a regular school, it's completely illegal.
I can assure you, definitely with Syrians and Lebanese and Palestinians in the Western world, they do have madrasas and they do hit you. When I was young, I used to go to a Palestinian and Lebanese Syrian school, like the 11 times school, and they would hit us at school. So,
Yeah.
Yeah, you brought up a good point that I wanted to make our next point, which is why don't they talk about this in the West? Like, why don't people know about this? And this is why the title, right? The silent violence. This is, I think, one of the biggest places where keeping things quiet starts. One of the things that they make the children do when they're getting beaten, they can't make a sound. They can't cry, they can't scream, they can't basically voice themselves. They can't be loud in any way. They're told to keep quiet. And everything is kept in the community, everything is kept quiet, and nobody talks about these things. And so, even in the West, these things are happening. It's just that they keep it, they can't talk about it. And that's why it's not many people know about it.
Now, I've heard of the not crying thing before. Now, that is something. The man who I first heard about this beating stuff from, specifically was the whip, was I forget which country exactly he's from, but I believe he was from North Africa, a North African Muslim. And he later left to Egypt and like that because he became a Christian when he still lived in the Muslim country, but he basically, his family just told him to leave. They didn't want him anymore. But he did say that he was told he can never cry, that men never cry. He'd only cry at night when he was in bed, when he was a child, because he was terrified to cry in front of his father and the school, because they would beat them for that. He'd only cry when he was in bed.
Miskeen, right? Like, and those things stick with you, right? They don't go away, especially because they start at such a young age. It's very visceral and very scary, and I feel bad for them for the beatings that they go through. It should be a human rights violation. But one of the biggest, another thing of why this is kept quiet. Who's Krabel? Oh,
Oh, Karbel? Yeah, he's a friend of mine.
is he Muslim? I don't want the
La,
views to be
no,
different.
he's not a Muslim. No, he's not a Muslim or a Christian. Trust me, he's no fan of Islam.
Hey, what's up, guys? How you doing?
Welcome, Kribble. How do you say your name?
Karbel.
Kirabil.
Kribble. Okay. Welcome. We're talking about Dugsi, and for our Arabic speakers, it's similar to madrasa or Islamic madrasas. So, moving on to the other part was, the justification and rationalization for the abuses that happen in Dugsi. One of the most unsettling aspects of the horrors within Dugsi is the justification and the rationalization provided by both the ma'alim, the teacher, and the parents. Children are often told that the ma'alim's methods are intended to help them learn and appreciate the Quran better. This manipulation of logic perpetuates a cycle of fear and submission, and as children grow to associate religious instruction with pain and trauma. And this is another thing, right? And I've noticed this in a lot of Somali children, or as they grow up, is they have a negative association with education because they believe that because of the beatings at such an early age, they have associated education with pain, education with beating, education with fear. And so, welcome, Jackie. So glad to have you. Um,
welcome, Jackie.
yeah, and so it's just very difficult for them to, without a lot of, and that's why I think it's so important for people to have religious trauma syndrome therapy for that, because these things happen at such a young age. It's very hard to deal with on your own. Parents and these teachers who, a lot of the times, these teachers are, when they're beating children, like I said, anything can trigger them, right? It doesn't even have to be that a child made a mistake in the memorization. They could just be having a bad day and take it out on that child. And if we look at Somalis with the trauma of the civil war, there's just so many things that have happened in the country, the genocides. And so people have a lot of their own pent up trauma, and they're taking out their anger and their frustration and hatred onto these children. And the parents, like I said, they use the Duksi as another way to discipline their children. And this continually perpetuates the cycle. Yeah, welcome to our new arrivals. Does anyone have, what do you guys have to add for the justification and how parents and ma'alins rationalize the abuse?
I would like to add something. These parents are mentally insane. Who the hell sends their kids to a school to get purposely to get beaten?
Oh, by the way, one
I've
thing I
heard
was
some
gonna
crazy things. I've heard some crazy things in my life, abuse stories, stuff like that. And heard of a lot of different crazy parents who've done sick, messed up things, but purposely sending them specifically to a school to get beaten. Now that is something new.
Right. I was just gonna add that this actually, I can't believe I skipped over this, but the one of the cornerstone of that justification is based in Islam, right? Muhammad says to beat children, especially at the very early ages with the salah, and if the children are not praying, you can beat them. There's nothing in the Quran and Hadith that says you should not beat your children. I think the only exception is do not beat them to death or do not leave marks on their body. But there's nothing that says you cannot beat your children, and there's nothing that says
Actually, that was included later. Once again, it's a kind of they duct tape to fix up the ugly aspects of the religion, but there's actually no caveat. Just like in Surah 34, the Surah Nisa, the chapter about women, where men are allowed to beat their wives. There's actually no caveat about beating her lightly and so on. When I was young, they added that little bracket, beat her lightly. But actually, in Arabic, it's quite clear. You can beat your children, you can beat your wife. A Muslim parent can even murder. And this is why honor killings are so common throughout the Islamic world. And you quite literally, there will be no court that will hold you responsible if you kill your children because they're just seen as property of the parents. It goes back to the fundamental problem of Islam. There's actually no caveat to you should beat them lightly or beat them fairly or whatever. It's just in the Arabic is quite clear you can beat them. Just like in Surah 434, the chapter about women, when it talks about it essentially legalizes domestic violence. There's no caveat to say now Muslim translators have added for Western audiences, beat her lightly and so on. Make sure you don't leave bruises, but there's actually no proof of it. And once again, I just wanted to go back to it goes back to the inception and origins of Islam. Islam has been steeped in violence from word. Everything about it is like, even like, for example, on another note, but it's related, the pre-Islamic Arabs, they didn't accept Islam based on the beauty of the Quran or whatever justification that Muslims will try to use. Like, they only accepted Islam when Muhammad took up the sword and started killing them or started threatening them with murder. That was the only way for people to. And it's actually funny, we should have had this clip. Yasir Qadi blatantly says it. He literally says that Islam spread by violence and the sword. His people did not accept Islam because they were debated and they appreciated the arguments of this new religion. No, they had a sword at their neck, and that's the reason why they were. This is why Islam means submission. It's got nothing to do with debate and conversion. It has everything to do with you submitting to new masters. And so what I'm trying to say is, so the practice of children being beaten, like children being indoctrinated into Islam, is a critical facet of Islam spread, because people say, oh, Muslims will say, oh, Islam is the fastest growing religion. That's actually not true. They have an extremely high birth rate, and that is how the religion spreads. So they have an impetus to indoctrinate every single child born into the faith. And when I say indoctrinate, once again, they don't have the arguments to win people over through rational debate and logic. They don't have logical arguments. They have to use violence. So they have to make people be afraid. So that's what they do with their children from day one.
absolutely. And I found the hadith, at least one of them, I'm still looking, I should have organized this, that it says by Abdullah ibn Amr in Sunan Abi Dawud, command your children to pray when they become 7 years old and beat them for it when they become 10 years old. And obviously, those numbers could be different based on the books. And with Muslims, those numbers are very flexible. Beat them is basically the commandment. You can beat your children for any kind of, it doesn't have to just be about salah, right? It could be any perceived sinful behavior that the parent can come up with. But Kirbel, did you have something to add? Jackie, did you have something to add?
Hey y'all, how y'all been doing?
Doing well. We haven't seen you in a while, Jackie. Glad to have you.
Yeah, I don't have much to add today, but I think just the idea that abusing children for the sake of religion, and it makes me angry because I'm at a loss for words at this point. I am just at a loss for words.
I know it's a lot. It's a lot to take in. But yeah, that's one of the biggest parts of why, and this is a big part of the indoctrination that Noon was talking about, when children are basically forced and beaten and indoctrinated, forced memorization, the abuse that they go through. It's so hard to analyze a lot of the to break away from it. It's almost that a lot of them have some kind of Stockholm syndrome. It's very difficult for them to break away from it. But the indoctrination starts very early, and just like Noon was saying, there's none of these things are being taught logically or rationally, but it's by beating, force, memorization, slavery. It doesn't matter anything to get the point across that you are supposed to submit in this religion. But to expand this out, some inactive mentioned this does include sexual violence, and it's true. And there's evidence of that in even the Muslim schools throughout the Western countries, where children are sexually abused in madrasas and Islamic schools, by the way, that are being paid for with taxpayer dollars. Taxpayer dollars are paying for, and I'm saying this as an American, so I don't know what it's like in the UK or other countries, but in America, there have been many instances where American taxpayer dollars are being spent on Islamic education under the guise of charter schools. So, an example of this actually happened in Minnesota. This school was eventually sued. So the ACLU sued a Twin Cities charter school that caters to Muslims. They filed a lawsuit against Tariq Ibn Ziyad Academy, also known as TISA, and also the Minnesota Department of Education, because the ACLU says they are at fault for failing to uncover and stopping the alleged religious teachings in these schools. And in the US, we have the separation of church and state. But with Muslims, again, they don't respect Western laws, right? They believe in Islamic supremacy, so their way goes. And so if they are getting taxpayer dollars with for these charter schools, they can now teach Islamic things in their schools. And the days that the government is auditing them, they basically just scrap that. And then as soon as they get out of the building, they can resume their Islamic teachings. And so TISA is the only one that one of the few that's been caught so far. But this is very normal. I went to an Islamic school, and I also went to a charter school as well, and they did have Islamic teachings in these places with taxpayer dollars. They were also using the same facilities for madrasa. The madrasa that I went to was actually a public school property, but we were being taught Arabic and we were being taught Islamic studies with these taxpayer dollars. And so there's a lot of these conflicting like that the government is not even aware of. But because everything is so hush, everything is so quieted, do not expose the Muslim community, because if you expose them, you're going to hell. And there's a filial piety that's also very much entrenched in that. And so people do not speak up about it. But yeah, just going back to the schools, this is not exclusive to the Duksis, but this also happens in the Islamic schools in the West. Go ahead, Jackie. I saw you come off.
Okay, that's a lot. So that's what I was gonna ask. If you was to try to ask them about that, I feel like I have the inclination that they're gonna excuse not inclination, but I have the gut feeling that they're gonna downplay it. They're gonna try to downplay it and say, "Oh, what sources are you getting that from? That's fake news. That's Islamophobic propaganda." So I just always wondered because I would see these little news stories about this school is being accused of being homophobic, just like the situation back where no gays allowed, no homosexuality allowed, abuse in these madrasas. But when you try to talk about that with them and ask them about it, they don't want to talk about it. They want to say, "Oh, that's right wing propaganda. You're getting Islamophobic propaganda." So that's why I always wondered about that.
There's just a lot of things that the government doesn't know, and nobody is basically keeping tabs on this about what's going on in a lot of these Muslim run institutions, the Dugsi, the Madrasa. But yeah, I will stop there for now.
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to say, yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. It's certainly something that taxpayer dollars are being mined for. They're very good at manipulating the Western system and, yeah, mining tax dollars and they also have